The year was 1881, and in the copper mining town of Copper Falls, Arizona Territory, the summer heat was the least of anyone's worries. This was a place where fortunes were made and lost faster than tumbleweeds rolled across the desert, where men came seeking their dreams in the earth and often found only debt and desperation instead. Copper Falls had sprung up almost overnight when rich copper deposits were discovered in the Dragoon Mountains. Within 5 years, it had grown from a handful of prospectors' tents to a bustling town of nearly 2,000 souls, complete with a main street lined with shops, 3 saloons, a church, and the inevitable collection of gambling halls that seemed to multiply like desert flowers after rain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town was a peculiar mixture of hope and hardship. Successful mine owners built grand houses on the hills overlooking the valley, their windows glowing with expensive oil lamps while their wives wore silk dresses shipped from San Francisco. But for every success story, there were dozens of failures, men who'd spent their life savings on worthless claims, families who'd traveled hundreds of miles only to find the easy copper had already been claimed by those who'd arrived first. Into this volatile mix had come the Brennan family in the spring of 1878. Patrick Brennan was an Irishman with calloused hands and big dreams, a man who'd worked the coal mines of Pennsylvania before heading west with his wife Margaret and their 4 young sons. Like so many others, Patrick believed that Arizona copper would be his family's salvation, the answer to years of backbreaking labor for someone else's profit. Margaret Brennan was a quiet woman with steel in her spine, the kind who could stretch $1 until it screamed and make a feast from scraps. She'd followed her husband west, not because she believed in his dreams, but because she believed in him. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, nothing like the green hills of County Cork where Patrick had been born, but Margaret was determined to make it home for their boys. The 4 Brennan sons were as different as seasons, but each carried their father's stubborn determination and their mother's quiet strength. Thomas, the eldest at 16, was serious beyond his years, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold old wisdom. He'd inherited his mother's practical nature and his father's work ethic, and had already proven himself capable of handling adult responsibilities when needed. Michael, 14, was the dreamer of the family, always sketching in the margins of old newspapers and seeing beauty where others saw only desert waste. He had gentle hands and an artist's soul, qualities that seemed almost miraculous in a place as rough as Copper Falls. Sean, 12, was all energy and mischief, quick with a joke and quicker with his fists when defending his family's honor. And little Danny, just 10 years old, was the heart of the family, with a smile that could light up the darkest mine shaft and a laugh that made even the hardest men in town soften their expressions. For 3 years, the Brennans had worked there, claim with determination that bordered on obsession. Patrick and Thomas spent 14 hours a day underground, following veins of copper ore that seemed to promise riches just around the next corner. Margaret took in laundry and mending to supplement their income, while Michael helped with the lighter mining tasks, and Sean and Danny did whatever odd jobs they could find in town. But the mine that had looked so promising when Patrick first staked his claim had proven as fickle as a desert spring. The copper was there, but it was embedded in rock so hard that extracting it cost more than the ore was worth. Month after month, the Brennans poured their labor and their hope into a hole in the ground that gave back barely enough to keep them fed. By the summer of 1881, Patrick Brennan was a desperate man, though he hid it well from his family. The money he'd borrowed to buy mining equipment was coming due, and the interest was mounting faster than he could pay. He owed money to the bank, to the general store, to other miners who'd been foolish enough to trust his promises of future prosperity. Most dangerous of all, he owed a substantial sum to Silas Cartwright, the most powerful and ruthless man in Copper Falls. Cartwright owned 3 of the most productive mines in the area, along with the largest general store, one of the saloons, and half the buildings on Main Street. He was a man who'd arrived in Copper Falls with money already in his pocket, and he'd used that advantage to systematically acquire the best claims and squeeze out competitors who couldn't afford to match his resources. He was also known for collecting his debts with interest and for being utterly ruthless with those who couldn't pay. Patrick had borrowed money from Cartwright to buy the equipment needed for deep mining, convinced that he was just months away from striking a rich vein that would solve all his problems. But the rich vein never materialized, and now Cartwright was demanding payment, not just of the principal, but of interest that had compounded to nearly double the original loan. The morning that would change everything began like any other in the Brennan household. Margaret was preparing breakfast over their small wood stove, while the boys got ready for another day of work and school. The one-room cabin they called home was cramped but clean, filled with the sounds of a family starting their day together. Thomas was sharpening mining tools, preparing for another long day underground with his father. Michael was carefully cleaning his slate for school, one of the few luxuries the family had managed to maintain despite their financial struggles. Sean was attempting to convince his mother that his torn shirt was perfectly acceptable for school, while Danny sat on the floor building elaborate structures with a set of wooden blocks his father had carved for him years earlier. It was a scene of domestic normalcy that gave no hint of the crisis approaching their door like a summer thunderstorm building on the horizon. Margaret hummed softly as she worked, an old Irish melody that Patrick had taught her during their courtship. The sound was comforting and familiar, a reminder of happier times when their biggest worry was whether the rent would be paid on time rather than whether they'd have food on the table next week. "Thomas," she called to her eldest son, "make sure your father eats something before you go down to the mine. He's been forgetting meals again." Thomas nodded seriously. At 16, he understood better than his younger brothers how precarious their situation had become. He'd seen the worry lines deepen around his father's eyes, had noticed how often Patrick stood staring at their claim, as if willing the copper to reveal itself through sheer determination. Patrick himself was outside, standing in the early morning, light, and looking down at the dark opening of their mine shaft. He'd been awake since before dawn, calculating and recalculating numbers that never seemed to add up the way he needed them to. In 3 days, Cartwright would expect payment of $800, money that Patrick simply didn't have and couldn't imagine how to get. He'd already sold everything of value the family owned, except for their mining tools and their cabin. Margaret's wedding ring had gone to the pawn shop months ago, along with the pocket watch that had belonged to Patrick's father. They were living on credit at the general store, credit that would be cut off the moment word spread that they couldn't pay Cartwright, but it was what Cartwright had hinted at during their last conversation that truly terrified Patrick. The man had suggested, with a coldness that made Patrick's blood run cold, that there were other ways to settle debts in the Arizona territory. Ways that didn't necessarily involve money. Patrick had heard the stories, whispered conversations, that stopped when he entered the saloon, tales of families who'd been forced to make arrangements that went beyond simple financial transactions. The desert was full of labor camps and work gangs, places where strong backs were more valuable than cash and where questions about how workers had been acquired were rarely asked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. As Patrick stood watching the sun rise over their failing claim, he heard the sound of horses approaching. 3 riders were making their way up the rocky path to the Brennan cabin, and Patrick's heart sank as he recognized the lead figure. Silas Cartwright rode like a man who owned everything he could see, which in Copper Falls was closer to truth. than most people realized. Cartwright was a big man, well-fed and well-dressed, in a territory where most people made do with work clothes and simple meals. His horse was the finest money could buy. His saddle was tooled leather that probably cost more than most families earned in a year, and his clothes were tailored to fit his substantial frame perfectly. Everything about him proclaimed wealth and power, and he wore both like armor. The two men riding with him were a different story entirely. Jake Morrison and Pete Hendricks were Cartwright's enforcers, men whose job it was to make sure that debts were paid and agreements were honored. They had the look of men who'd grown comfortable with violence, who'd learned to see other people as obstacles to be removed or tools to be used, rather than as fellow human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Patrick straightened his shoulders and walked forward to meet them, though every instinct told him to gather his family and run. But where could they run to? They had no money for train fare, no relatives to take them in, no resources to start over somewhere else. This was their stand for better or worse. "Morning, Brennan," Cartwright called out, not bothering to dismount. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Perfect weather for settling accounts." "Mr. Cartwright," Patrick replied carefully, his Irish accent thickening slightly as it always did when he was under stress. "I wasn't expecting you quite so early." Cartwright smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Well, Patrick, I've been thinking about our arrangement, and I realized we need to have a more detailed conversation about payment options. You see, I've been patient, more patient than most men in my position would be, but patience has its limits." From inside the cabin, Margaret appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices. Her face paled when she saw Cartwright, though she tried to hide her fear behind a mask of polite attention. The boys clustered behind her, sensing the tension in the air, even if they didn't fully understand its source. "I've been working the claim every day," Patrick said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his stomach. "The copper's there, Mr. Cartwright. I just need a little more time to extract enough to—" "Time," Cartwright interrupted, "is exactly what we don't have. You see, Patrick, I've got other investments that require immediate attention, and I need to liquidate some of my outstanding loans. That means your debt comes due today, not in 3 days, as we originally agreed." Patrick felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "Today? But Mr. Cartwright, we agreed that you'd pay me back with interest," Cartwright said coldly. "We never agreed that I'd wait indefinitely for you to find copper that may not exist. $800, Patrick, right now." The silence that followed was broken only by the desert wind whistling through the rocks and the distant sound of pickaxes ringing against stone from other claims. Margaret stepped closer to her husband, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of support that made Cartwright's smile widen unpleasantly. "I don't have $800, Patrick said quietly. "You know I don't have that kind of money." "No," Cartwright agreed, "you don't. But you do have other assets, valuable assets that could more than cover your debt." Patrick's blood turned to ice as Cartwright's meaning became clear. "My sons are not assets, Cartwright. They're my children. They're strong, healthy boys," Cartwright continued, as if Patrick hadn't spoken. "Good workers. There are mines in California that pay well for experienced hands, lumber camps in Oregon that need strong backs, cattle ranches in Texas that can always use help. The transportation and placement fees alone would cover your debt, and the boys would have work guaranteed for, let's say, 5 years. That's generous considering the compound interest on your loan." Margaret gasped, pulling her sons closer to her, as the full horror of what Cartwright was suggesting became clear. This wasn't just about debt collection. This was about human trafficking, about selling children into what amounted to slavery. "You're talking about my sons," Patrick said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. "You're talking about breaking up my family. I'm talking about a business arrangement," Cartwright replied smoothly. Your boys get steady work, I get my money back, and you get a chance to start over without the burden of debt. Everyone wins." Thomas stepped forward, his young face set with determination that reminded everyone present of his father. "We're not going anywhere with you," he said firmly. "This is our family, and families stick together." Cartwright's enforcers shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to the weapons they carried. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. "Thomas," Margaret whispered urgently, but her eldest son stood his ground. "Boy," Cartwright said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, "you'd be wise to let the adults handle this conversation. Children who speak out of turn in the Arizona Territory sometimes find themselves in very uncomfortable situations." Patrick stepped between his son and Cartwright, his protective instincts overriding his fear. "You leave my boys out of this. If you have a problem with me, we'll settle it between us." "Oh, but they are the settlement, Patrick," Cartwright said with false reasonableness. 4 strong boys, already experienced in mining work, trained to follow orders and work hard. In California, boys like yours go for $200 each, plus transportation fees. That's more than enough to cover your debt and even leave you with a little profit. The mathematical precision of Cartwright's calculation made the whole conversation even more horrifying. He wasn't talking about children, he was talking about commodities, about human beings reduced to dollar amounts and market values. Michael, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "What about school? What about learning to read and write properly?" Cartwright laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. "Education's a luxury, boy. Where you'd be going, the only education you need is how to swing a pickaxe or handle cattle. You'll learn plenty." "They're children," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "Thomas is only 16, Danny's just 10 years old. You can't seriously be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Mrs. Brennan," Cartwright interrupted. "I'm explaining the terms of debt settlement. Your husband borrowed money, your husband can't pay it back, and now your family needs to make good on the obligation. It's simple business." Sean, true to his nature, couldn't contain himself any longer. "You're a monster," he burst out, earning sharp looks from both his parents. "You can't just take people away from their families like they're horses or cattle." Cartwright's expression darkened. "Careful, boy. Young men with smart mouths sometimes find themselves in work situations that require attitude adjustments." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunpowder blast. Everyone present understood that Cartwright wasn't just talking about legitimate employment. He was describing a system where children could disappear into a network of labor camps and work gangs, places where they might never be seen again. Patrick looked at his wife and sons, seeing the fear in their eyes, but also the defiance. They were his family, his responsibility, his whole world. The thought of losing them was worse than any physical pain he'd ever endured. "I need time," he said desperately. "Give me 1 more week, and I'll find a way to pay you. I'll sell the claim, I'll work for someone else, I'll do whatever it takes." "The claim's worthless, Patrick, and we both know it," Cartwright replied. "You've been digging that hole for 3 years, and all you've found is disappointment. As for working for someone else, who's going to hire a man who can't even make his own mine profitable?" The cruel accuracy of Cartwright's assessment cut deeper than any physical blow. Patrick had indeed been fooling himself about the mines. Potential, clinging to hope long after reason should have told him to quit. "There has to be another way," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some other arrangement we can make." Cartwright pretended to consider this, though his decision had clearly been made before he'd ridden up to their cabin. "Well, there is one other option. You could give me the oldest 3 boys, Thomas, Michael, and Sean, and keep the youngest. Danny's a bit small for heavy labor anyway, so he wouldn't bring as much on the market. 3 boys would cover most of your debt, and I'd be willing to forgive the remainder as a gesture of goodwill." The suggestion that he might be merciful by taking only 3/4 of their children was so obscene that for a moment no one could speak. It was Danny himself who broke the silence. "I don't want my brothers to go away," he said in a small voice that carried clearly in the desert air. "Why can't we all stay together?" Cartwright looked down at the 10-year-old boy with something that might have been amusement. "Because, little fellow, sometimes families have to make sacrifices. Your brothers would be making a sacrifice so that you and your parents can start fresh." "That's not a sacrifice," Danny said with the clear logic of childhood. "That's just being mean." Margaret knelt down and pulled Danny close, as if she could protect him from the reality of their situation through sheer force of will. Thomas, Michael, and Sean moved closer to their parents, instinctively forming a defensive circle against the threat facing their family. Patrick looked at Cartwright's hard face and saw no mercy there, no possibility of negotiation or compromise. This was a man who'd made his decision and would carry it out regardless of the human cost. "I won't do it," Patrick said finally. "I won't hand my children over to you like they're livestock. There has to be another way." Cartwright's smile disappeared entirely. "There is no other way, Brennan. You borrowed money, you can't pay it back, and now you pay in the only currency you have left. This is how business works in the Arizona Territory." "This isn't business," Patrick replied, his Irish temper finally breaking through his attempts at diplomacy. "This is slavery, pure and simple. You want to buy and sell children like they're animals. I want to collect a legitimate debt," Cartwright said coldly. "If that requires alternative payment methods, so be it. You have until noon to decide, all 4 boys, or just the 3 oldest. Either way, someone's leaving with me today." With that ultimatum delivered, Cartwright wheeled his horse around and rode back down the path, his enforcers following behind. The dust cloud they raised hung in the air long after they'd disappeared, a visible reminder of the threat that had just shattered the Brennan family's world. Patrick stood watching them go, his mind racing through possibilities and finding no solutions. Margaret gathered her sons around her, holding them close, as if she could keep them safe through sheer determination. "Pa," Thomas said quietly, "what are we going to do?" Patrick turned to look at his eldest son, seeing not the boy Thomas had been, but the man he was becoming. At 16, Thomas understood the gravity of their situation as clearly as any adult. "I don't know, son," Patrick admitted, "but I'll find a way. Families don't get broken up on my watch." But even as he spoke the words, Patrick Brennan wondered if he was making a promise he couldn't keep. In the harsh arithmetic of the Arizona Territory, good intentions counted for very little against the cold reality of debt and power. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky, marking the passage of time toward Cartwright's noon deadline. Somewhere in Copper Falls, decisions were being made that would determine whether the Brennan family would survive intact or be scattered to the winds like seeds in a desert storm. The morning that had begun like any other was rapidly becoming the most important day in the lives of 4 boys who had never asked for anything more than the chance to grow up together, protected by parents who loved them and would do anything to keep them safe. But sometimes, in places like the Arizona Territory in 1881, love wasn't enough to overcome the harsh realities of money, power, and the men who wielded both without conscience or mercy. The clock was ticking toward noon, and the Brennan family was about to discover just how far a desperate father would go to save his children from a fate worse than anything the desert could offer. The desert sun climbed mercilessly toward its zenith as the Brennan family huddled inside their one-room cabin, the weight of Cartwright's ultimatum pressing down on them like the suffocating heat. Patrick paced the small space like a caged wolf, his mind frantically searching for solutions that seemed as elusive as water in the Sonoran desert. Margaret sat on their single wooden chair, Danny on her lap, while the 3 older boys stood nearby, their young faces etched with a gravity no child should have to bear. "There's got to be something," Patrick muttered, running his hands through his hair for the 100th time. "Some law, some authority we can appeal to." Thomas, ever practical despite his youth, shook his head grimly. "Pa, you know as well as I do that Cartwright owns half the territorial officials. Sheriff Hawkins is in his pocket, and the territorial judge owes him money too. There's no law out here except what men like Cartwright make." The bitter truth of his eldest son's words hit Patrick like a physical blow. The Arizona Territory in 1881 was still largely frontier justice, where might made right, and those with money and guns made the rules. Cartwright had both in abundance, while the Brennans had neither. Michael, who'd been unusually quiet, suddenly looked up from where he'd been sketching nervously in the dirt floor with a stick. "What about the railroad people? Don't they have authority over the territorial government?" Margaret stroked Danny's hair as she considered this. "The railroads got their own problems, sweetheart. They're more interested in laying track and moving cargo than protecting mining families." Sean, his fists clenched with barely contained rage, burst out, "This is America. You can't just buy and sell people like they're cattle. There's got to be someone who'll stand up to Cartwright." "Should be that way, son," Patrick said heavily. "But out here, money talks louder than justice most of the time." As the family grappled with their impossible situation, none of them noticed the figure watching from the ridge overlooking their claim. Joseph Yazzie had been observing the Brennan family for weeks, though they remained unaware of his presence. To the white settlers of Copper Falls, he was simply another Navajo who occasionally came to town to trade, largely invisible in the way that Native Americans had become to most territorial residents. But Joseph Yazzie was far from invisible to those who knew how to see. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, though the desert sun and the weight of profound loss had etched lines on his face that made him appear older. His clothing was a careful blend of traditional Navajo garb and practical frontier wear: buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt, and a hat that shaded his dark eyes from the relentless sun. Those eyes held depths of wisdom and sorrow that spoke of experiences most men never survived. Joseph had been born in the time before the Long Walk, when the Diné people still lived freely in their traditional homeland. He remembered the stories his grandfather told of the time when the Navajo Nation stretched across vast territories, when the people lived in harmony with the land and followed the old ways without interference from the Bilagana, the white. But Joseph's childhood had been shattered when he was 12 years old, the same age as Sean Brennan. The year was 1864, and Colonel Kit Carson was conducting his brutal campaign to force the Navajo people from their ancestral lands. Joseph's family had been among the 8,000 Diné who were forced to march 300 miles to the desolate internment camp at Bosque Redondo, a journey so horrific it became known as the Long Walk. The memory of that march still haunted Joseph's dreams. He could still see his grandmother falling by the wayside, too weak to continue, and the soldiers refusing to let the family stop to help her. He remembered his little sister crying from hunger and thirst as they trudged across the desert. Remembered watching his father's proud spirit break under the weight of helplessness and humiliation. 4 years they had spent at Bosque Redondo, 4 years of starvation, disease, and despair as the government attempted to turn the Navajo into farmers, on land that wouldn't grow crops, as they tried to remake a proud people in the image of their white captors. Joseph's parents had died there, his father from despair, and his mother from the sickness that swept through the overcrowded camp like wildfire. When the Navajo were finally allowed to return to their homeland in 1868, Joseph was among the survivors who made the long journey back. But the boy who had been forced to leave was gone forever, replaced by a young man who understood that the world had changed in ways that could never be undone. In the years that followed, Joseph had tried to rebuild his life according to the old ways. He had married a woman named Maria, whose family had also survived the Long Walk, and together they had found a small measure of peace in the traditional Navajo lands. Joseph became a skilled silversmith and horse trader, respected among his people for his wisdom and his ability to navigate the complex relationship between the Navajo nation and the encroaching white settlers. But tragedy had found Joseph again, 8 months ago, when raiding Apaches had attacked a small group of Navajo families traveling to a trading post. Maria and their 7-year-old son, Little Wolf, had been among those killed in the brutal raid. Joseph had been away, delivering horses to a ranch near Tucson, and by the time he returned, there was nothing left but graves and grief. The loss had broken something fundamental inside Joseph Yazzie. He had performed the proper ceremonies for his wife and son, had observed the traditional mourning periods, but the emptiness in his heart remained as vast as the desert itself. He had begun wandering, unable to find peace in his old life, unable to imagine a future without the family that had given his existence meaning. It was during one of these aimless wanderings that Joseph had first encountered the Brennan family. He had been watching Copper Falls from the hills, trying to understand the white man's endless hunger for the earth's treasures, when he noticed Patrick and Thomas working their claim with a dedication that reminded him of his own people's relationship with the land. Unlike many of the miners who saw the earth as something to be conquered and exploited, the Brennans seemed to approach their work with something approaching respect. They didn't blast and tear at the rock face with the reckless abandon of men seeking quick riches. Instead, they worked methodically, carefully, as if they understood that the earth required patience and understanding rather than brute force. Joseph had continued watching them over the weeks that followed, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the way Patrick protected his sons while teaching them the value of honest work. Perhaps it was the sight of Margaret hanging laundry while humming old songs, a picture of domestic contentment that reminded him painfully of his own lost happiness. Or perhaps it was the boys themselves. Thomas, with his serious demeanor and careful attention to his father's instruction. Michael, with his artistic soul, always stopping to study the way light fell across the rocks or the flight patterns of desert birds. Sean, with his protective instincts toward his younger brother, always ready to fight anyone who might threaten his family, and Danny, whose laughter carried across the desert like cool water, whose innocent joy in simple things reminded Joseph of his own son. Over time, Joseph had come to understand the Brennan family situation. He spoke enough English to follow conversations when he came to town to trade, and the troubles of Irish miners were common knowledge among anyone who paid attention to Copper Falls' gossip. He knew about Patrick's mounting debts, about Cartwright's reputation for ruthless debt collection, about the family's increasingly desperate circumstances. What he hadn't expected was to witness the morning's confrontation between Cartwright and the Brennans. From his vantage point on the ridge, Joseph had seen and heard everything. Cartwright's ultimatum, the family's horror, the casual way the wealthy mine owner had discussed selling children as if they were livestock. The sight had awakened something in Joseph that he'd thought died with his wife and son. It was a protective fury, a determination to prevent another family from being torn apart by forces beyond their control. He had seen too much loss, too much unnecessary suffering, to stand by and watch while innocents were destroyed by powerful men who cared nothing for human dignity. As Joseph watched the Brennan family struggle with their impossible situation, he began to formulate a plan. It was audacious, risky, and would require him to step far outside the careful boundaries he'd maintained between his world and the white settlers' world. But sometimes, he reflected, the old ways demanded that a man take action regardless of the personal cost. Joseph had resources that the Brennans couldn't imagine. Years of successful horse trading and silversmithing had made him wealthy by any standard, though he lived simply and kept his prosperity hidden from those who might seek to exploit it. More importantly, he had knowledge. knowledge of desert trails that could take a family far from Cartwright's reach, knowledge of people who would help without asking questions, knowledge of places where a family could disappear until the immediate danger passed. But first, he needed to understand more about the situation in Copper Falls. Joseph made his way down from the ridge, moving with the silent grace that had been trained into him since childhood. He needed information, and he knew where to get it. The Silver Dollar Saloon was the unofficial information center of Copper Falls, where rumors were traded as freely as whiskey, and where a man could learn everything he needed to know about the town's business if he knew how to listen. Joseph had occasionally visited the establishment to trade horses with some of the miners, and while his presence wasn't exactly welcome, it was tolerated as long as he didn't cause trouble. As Joseph pushed through the saloon's batwing doors, the conversation level dropped noticeably. The dozen or so patrons looked up from their drinks and card games to study the newcomer, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Joseph was accustomed to such reactions and ignored them, making his way to the bar where Harry Mullins, the saloon keeper, was polishing glasses with mechanical precision. "Whiskey," Joseph said simply, placing a silver dollar on the scarred wooden bar. Mullins hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable, but the sight of real money overcame his reluctance. He poured a shot and slid it across the bar, pocketing the dollar with practiced efficiency. Joseph sipped his drink and listened as the conversation gradually resumed around him. It didn't take long for the topic to turn to the morning's events at the Brennan claim, and Joseph found himself hearing the story from multiple perspectives. "Heard Cartwright rode out to the Irish family's place this morning," said a bearded miner named Peterson. "Word is, they owe him a pile of money they can't pay." "Poor bastards," muttered another voice. "Cartwright's got no mercy when it comes to collecting debts. Remember what happened to the Rodriguez family last year?" Joseph's attention sharpened. The Rodriguez family had been Mexican miners who'd also fallen behind on payments to Cartwright. Their story had become a cautionary tale throughout Copper Falls, though the details were often whispered rather than spoken aloud. "Different situation," Peterson replied. "Rodriguez was a grown man who knew the risks when he borrowed money. The Brennans got kids involved." "Kids don't make no difference to Cartwright," said a third voice. "Business is business far as he's concerned." A newcomer to the conversation, a man Joseph didn't recognize, leaned forward with interest. "What's this about kids?" "Brennan's got 4 boys," Peterson explained. "Word is, Cartwright's offered to take them as payment for the debt, ship them off to work camps in California or Oregon, where they can earn out what their father owes." The newcomer whistled low. "That's cold, even for this territory. Those boys can't be more than children. Oldest one's maybe 16, Peterson said. Rest are younger, but they're strong, and they know mining work, worth good money to the right buyer." Joseph felt his jaw clench as he listened to grown men discuss the sale of children with the same casual interest they might show in discussing livestock prices. The fact that such conversations could take place openly in a public establishment spoke volumes about how normalized such practices had become in the lawless atmosphere of the Arizona Territory. "Cartwright give them any kind of deadline?" the newcomer asked. "Noon today," Peterson replied. "Either they pay up or hand over the boys. Cartwright's not known for making idle threats." Joseph glanced at the clock above the bar and felt his pulse quicken. It was already past 11 o'clock, which meant the Brennan family had less than an hour to find a solution to their impossible situation. As Joseph finished his whiskey and prepared to leave, he overheard another conversation that made his blood run cold. 2 men at a corner table were discussing Cartwright's business practices in more detail, and their words painted a picture of systematic exploitation that went far beyond simple debt collection. "Cartwright's got contacts all over the territory," one of them was saying. "Work camps, cattle ranches, mining operations that need cheap labor. He's been supplying them with workers for years." Workers or slaves? his companion asked quietly. What's the difference? Once those people get shipped, out they disappear. Might as well be dead for all their families ever see them again. Joseph had heard enough. He left the saloon and walked quickly toward the general store, where he knew he could gather more specific information about Cartwright's operation and the resources he'd need for what he was planning. The general store was run by Wilhelm Hoffmann, a German immigrant who'd earned a reputation for fairness and discretion in his business dealings. Unlike many of the other merchants in Copper Falls, Hoffmann wasn't in Cartwright's pocket, though he was careful not to openly oppose the powerful mine owner. Mr. Yazzie, Hoffmann greeted him as Joseph entered the store. What can I do for you today? I need information, Joseph said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. About Silas Cartwright's business arrangements with families who can't pay their debts. Hoffmann's expression grew guarded. That's dangerous talk, Mr. Yazzie. Cartwright doesn't appreciate people discussing his private business. I'm not looking to cause trouble, Joseph assured him, but I need to understand how his system works. Who does he deal with? Where does he send people? Hoffmann studied Joseph's face for a long moment, apparently seeing something there that convinced him to take the risk. Why do you want to know? Because a family is about to be destroyed, and I might be able to prevent it. The German merchant was quiet for several seconds, weighing the risks against his own moral convictions. Finally, he nodded and gestured for Joseph to follow him to the back of the store, where they could speak without being overheard. Cartwright has arrangements with labor contractors throughout the Southwest, Hoffmann said quietly. Mining companies in California that need experienced workers, lumber operations in Oregon, cattle ranches in Texas. He provides them with people who are motivated to work hard. Motivated how? Joseph asked, though he already suspected them. And sir, debt bondage, Hoffmann replied grimly. The workers are told they're earning money to pay off family debts, but somehow the debts never get smaller. Meanwhile, their families back home are told the workers are doing well and will return when their obligations are met. But they never return. Not in my experience. Once Cartwright ships someone out, they disappear into the system. Could be working anywhere from Mexico to Canada by now. Joseph felt a cold fury building in his chest. The system Hoffmann was describing was slavery in all but name, a network of human trafficking that preyed on desperate families and vulnerable children. How does he transport them? Joseph asked. Usually by wagon train to the nearest railroad, then by rail to wherever they're going. He's got trusted drivers who ask no questions and guards who make sure nobody changes their mind along the way. Joseph absorbed this information, already beginning to see ways it could be used to protect the Brennan family. But first, he needed to act quickly. Time was running out, and Cartwright wouldn't be patient if noon arrived without a resolution. Mr. Hoffmann, Joseph said carefully, if someone wanted to help a family disappear before Cartwright could get his hands on them, what would be the best way? The German merchant's eyes widened as he understood what Joseph was suggesting. Mr. Yazzie, you're talking about making some very powerful enemies. Cartwright doesn't just let people walk away from their debts. Let me worry about Cartwright, Joseph replied. Right now, I need to know about safe routes out of the territory and people who might be willing to help a family start over somewhere else. Hoffmann was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, his basic decency won out over his caution. There are Mormon settlements in Utah that sometimes take in families needing fresh starts, he said quietly. Good. People who ask few questions as long as you're willing to work hard and live by their rules. And there are Quakers in Colorado who help people escaping difficult situations. How would a family reach these places? There's an old Apache trail that runs north through the mountains. Dangerous, but it avoids the main roads where Cartwright might have people watching. A man who knew the desert could guide a family through. In about 10 days, Joseph nodded, already forming the outlines of a plan. One more question. If someone wanted to settle a debt with Cartwright directly, what would that take? Hoffman looked puzzled. You mean pay the money? From what I hear, the Brennan family owes about $800, plus interest. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime. $800. Joseph had that much and more, carefully saved over years of successful trading. But simply paying the debt wouldn't solve the underlying problem. It would only postpone the inevitable reckoning between families like the Brennans and predators like Cartwright. As Joseph left the general store, his mind was already working through the details of what would need to happen in the next few hours. He had the resources to help the Brennan family, but success would require perfect timing and a willingness to risk everything he'd built in his new life. The clock above. The bank showed 11:30 as Joseph mounted his horse and rode toward the Brennan claim. In 30 minutes, Cartwright would return, expecting either payment or children. But if Joseph's plan worked, the mine owner would find neither. Instead, he would discover that sometimes the most unlikely protectors emerged from the most unexpected places, and that the bonds of shared suffering could create alliances that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and culture. The desert wind carried the sound of Joseph's horse's hooves as he rode toward what he hoped would be the salvation of 4 innocent boys and the redemption of his own wounded spirit. Time was running out, but Joseph Yazzie had learned long ago that the most important battles were often won or lost in the final moments before surrender seemed inevitable. Ahead lay the Brennan claim, where a family waited in desperate hope for a miracle they couldn't imagine. Behind rode a Navajo warrior whose own losses had prepared him to risk everything to prevent others from suffering the same devastating separation that had defined his own life. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Joseph's courage and cunning, but the very notion of what constituted family in the harsh landscape of the American frontier. Joseph Yazzie crested the final ridge overlooking the Brennan claim as the sun reached its merciless peak. Below him, the scene was exactly as he'd expected, and far worse than he'd hoped. 3 black specks on the horizon were growing larger by the minute. Cartwright and his enforcers arriving precisely at noon for their grim appointment. But what Joseph hadn't anticipated was the crowd that had gathered around the Brennan cabin. Word of the family's plight had spread through Copper Falls like wildfire through dry brush. Nearly 50 townspeople had made the trek up to the claim, drawn by a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine sympathy. Some had come to bear witness, others to offer what little help they could, and still others simply because they couldn't bear to stay away while a family was torn apart before their eyes. Dr. Samuel Morrison stood near his medical wagon, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that he might soon be treating children traumatized by forced separation from their parents. Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who served Copper Falls' Mexican and Irish populations, clutched his rosary and murmured prayers in Spanish. Even some of the saloon girls had come, women who knew firsthand what it meant to be sold and untraded like property. But the most significant presence was Sheriff Tom Hawkins, though his reason for being there was far from reassuring. Hawkins was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a badge that had been bought and paid for by Silas Cartwright. He stood apart from the crowd, his hand resting casually on his gun belt, making it clear that anyone who interfered with Cartwright's business would face legal consequences. Inside the cabin, the Brennan family had reached the end of their desperate deliberations. Patrick sat slumped in their single wooden chair, his face grey with defeat. He'd sent Thomas into town an hour earlier to attempt one final, futile negotiation with the bank, but both father and son knew it was hopeless. The bank had no money, to lend to a man whose only collateral was a worthless mining claim. Margaret stood at the small window, watching the approaching riders with the hollow-eyed stare of a woman witnessing the destruction of everything she held dear. Michael sat on the floor, no longer sketching, but simply staring at his hands as if trying to memorize them before they were taken away to places unknown. Sean paced the small space like a caged animal, his fists clenched and his young face twisted, with rage at his own powerlessness. Only Danny seemed unaware of the full gravity of their situation. The 10-year-old sat on the bed, carefully arranging his wooden blocks into elaborate structures and then knocking them down, lost in the simple repetition of creation and destruction that seemed to mirror the larger forces at work in his family's life. "Ma," Danny said suddenly, looking up from his blocks, "when Tommy comes back from town, are we going to have a party? Everyone's here." Margaret's composure finally cracked. She knelt beside her youngest son and pulled him into her arms, tears streaming down her face as she tried to find words that would prepare him for what was about to happen without destroying his innocence entirely. "Danny, sweetheart," she whispered, "some men are coming to take you and your brothers away. They say it's because Pa owes them money, and this is the only way to pay it back." Danny pulled back to look at his mother's face, his young mind struggling to process information that made no sense in his world of blocks and games and family dinners. "Take us where, Ma? For how long?" "I don't know, baby, I don't know." The sound of horses pulling up outside silenced any further conversation. Through the window, Margaret could see Cartwright dismounting from his expensive stallion with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. His enforcers, Morrison and Hendricks, remained mounted, their eyes scanning the crowd for potential trouble. Patrick stood slowly, his movements those of a man walking to his own execution. He'd made his decision during the long morning hours, a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life, but which seemed like the only option that offered any hope for his family's survival. "Boys," he said quietly, his voice barely audible, "come here." Thomas had returned from town just minutes earlier, his face confirming what everyone already knew. There would be no last-minute reprieve from the bank, no miraculous discovery of hidden resources, no cavalry riding to their rescue. The four brothers stood together in the center of their small cabin, unconsciously forming the protective circle that had been their instinct since early childhood. "I want you to listen to me carefully," Patrick continued, his Irish accent thick, with emotion. "What's about to happen isn't your fault, and it doesn't change how much your mother and I love you. You're good boys, all of you, and you'll always be our sons no matter where life takes you." "Pa," Thomas said quietly, "we know, and we'll take care of each other, just like you taught us." Outside, Cartwright's voice cut through the desert air like a blade. "Brennan, time's up. Let's get this business concluded." Patrick looked at his wife and sons one final time, trying to memorize their faces, trying to find some way to carry their memory with him through whatever came next. Then he walked to the door and stepped outside to face the man who was about to destroy his family. The crowd fell silent as Patrick emerged from the cabin, his shoulders squared despite the defeat written across his features. Cartwright sat comfortably in his saddle, checking a gold pocket watch with theatrical precision. "Right on time, Patrick," Cartwright said with false joviality. "I do appreciate punctuality in business matters. Now, have you reached a decision about our arrangement?" Patrick opened his mouth to speak, to surrender his children, to save them from something even worse, when a new voice cut across the scene, like thunder rolling down from the mountains. "Perhaps we should discuss alternative arrangements." Every head turned toward the source of the voice. Joseph Yazzie sat motionless on his horse at the edge of the gathering, his presence so sudden and unexpected that several people actually gasped in surprise. He had approached with the silent, skill of his ancestors, using the crowd's focus on Cartwright to mask his arrival. Cartwright's expression shifted from surprise to annoyance. "This is a private business matter, Indian. Move along before you find yourself in trouble you can't handle." Joseph ignored the threat and dismounted with fluid grace, his movements deliberate and confident. He wore traditional Navajo jewelry, silver and turquoise that caught the sunlight and proclaimed his heritage with quiet pride. But his bearing was that of a man completely comfortable in any world he chose to enter. "Mr. Cartwright," Joseph said, his English precise and unaccented, "I believe you're conducting business that affects the entire community. That makes it a matter of public interest." Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward, his hand moving to his gun. "You heard Mr. Cartwright, Indian. This ain't none of your concern." Joseph's dark eyes fixed on the sheriff with an intensity that made Hawkins take an involuntary step backward. "Sheriff, I'm curious about the legal precedent for selling children to satisfy adult debts. Perhaps you could explain which territorial statutes authorize such transactions." The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunpowder blast. Hawkins' face flushed red as he realized he'd been trapped by his own corruption. Technically, what Cartwright was proposing wasn't legal. It was simply tolerated because he had the power to make it happen and the connections to ensure no one questioned his methods. Dr. Morrison stepped forward from the crowd, his medical training giving him authority that even Cartwright had to respect. "The gentleman raises a valid point, Mr. Cartwright. I'm not aware of any law that permits the sale of children, regardless of family debts." Cartwright's mask of civility began to slip. "Doctor, I suggest you stick to medicine and leave business matters to those who understand them. As for you," he said, turning back to Joseph, "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but no game." Joseph interrupted quietly. "Simply a business proposition that might interest you more than your current arrangement." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding. Patrick Brennan stood frozen in his doorway, afraid to hope but unable to look away from this unexpected intervention. Joseph reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of heavy silver coins. "Mr. Cartwright, I understand the Brennan family owes you $800 plus accumulated interest. I'm prepared to settle that debt in full, immediately, in exchange for cancellation of all claims against the family." The silence that followed was broken only by the desert wind whistling through the rocks. Even Cartwright seemed stunned by the suddenness and simplicity of the offer. "You're offering to pay their debt?" Cartwright asked, his voice betraying his surprise. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Joseph confirmed. "Cash payment, full settlement, all parties released from further obligation." Patrick found his voice. "At last, Mr. Yazzie, I can't let you do that. It's too much money and we have no way to pay you back." Joseph turned to look at the Irish miner, his expression gentle but determined. "Mr. Brennan, sometimes debts are paid in ways that have nothing to do with money. Your family deserves to stay together, and I have the means to ensure that happens." Margaret appeared in the doorway behind her husband, the 4 boys clustered around her. She studied Joseph's face with the intuitive wisdom of a mother trying to determine whether this stranger represented salvation or simply a different kind of danger. "Why would you help us?" she asked quietly. "You don't even know us." Joseph was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving from Margaret to the 4 boys who stood behind her. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of profound loss and hard-won wisdom. "Mrs. Brennan, I know what it means to lose family. I know what it feels like to be powerless while those you love are taken away. If I can prevent another family from experiencing that pain, then perhaps some meaning can come from my own losses." Cartwright had been listening to this exchange with growing irritation, and now he erupted with the fury of a man whose carefully laid plans were being disrupted by forces he didn't understand. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "I have a legal agreement with Brennan. He borrowed money, he can't pay it back, and we've agreed on terms for settlement. Some Indian can't just right in here and—" "Can't what?" Joseph asked mildly. "Pay a legitimate debt with legal currency? I wasn't aware that American money became invalid when offered by a Navajo." Dr. Morrison suppressed a smile at Joseph's dry wit, while several members of the crowd began to murmur approvingly. The doctor stepped forward again, sensing an opportunity to strike a blow against Cartwright's reign of terror. "Mr. Cartwright," Dr. Morrison said loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear, "surely you're not suggesting that you'd refuse legal payment of a debt simply because of the race of the person offering it? That would raise some interesting questions about your business practices." Cartwright realized he was being maneuvered into a corner. If he refused Joseph's offer, he would appear to be motivated by racial prejudice rather than legitimate business interests. But if he accepted, he would lose not only the Brennan boys, but also the example their fate would set for other families who might consider defaulting on their debts. "The terms of settlement have already been agreed upon," Cartwright said stiffly. "Brennan and I have a contract." "Actually," said a new voice from the crowd, "that's not entirely accurate." Everyone turned to see Wilhelm Hoffman, the German storekeeper, pushing through the crowd with a ledger book in his hands. His face was pale but determined, and he moved with the careful precision of a man who had made a dangerous decision and was committed to seeing it through. "Mr. Hoffman," Cartwright said warningly, "I don't recall asking for your opinion on this matter." "Perhaps not," Hoffman replied, opening his ledger with steady hands. "But as the unofficial record keeper for many of Copper Falls' business transactions, I feel obligated to point out certain irregularities in your claims against the Brennan family." Cartwright's face went white, then flushed deep red. "What irregularities?" Hoffman adjusted his spectacles and began reading from his careful records. "According to my calculations, Mr. Brennan borrowed $400 from you 18 months ago. The agreed-upon interest rate was 20% annually, which would bring the current debt to $480, not the $800 you've been claiming." The crowd erupted in angry murmurs. Several miners who had borrowed money from Cartwright began calculating their own debts, realizing they too might have been victims of predatory lending practices. "Furthermore," Hoffman continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his subject, "I have records showing that Mr. Brennan has made several payments totaling $160, which would reduce his actual debt to approximately $320. Cartwright's enforcers shifted nervously in their saddles, sensing the mood of the crowd turning ugly. These were men who understood violence, but they were vastly outnumbered and facing a group of people who had suddenly realized they'd been systematically cheated and exploited. "That ledger is unofficial and inadmissible," Cartwright blustered, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Perhaps," Dr. Morrison said thoughtfully, "but it does raise questions that might interest the territorial authorities. Questions about usury, fraud, and possibly even extortion." Joseph watched this byplay with satisfaction, recognizing that Hoffman and Dr. Morrison were providing him with exactly the opening he needed. The German storekeeper had taken an enormous risk by challenging Cartwright publicly, but his courage was creating opportunities that Joseph could exploit. "Mr. Cartwright," Joseph said quietly, his voice cutting through the crowd's angry murmurs, "it seems your debt calculations might be imprecise. However, I'm still prepared to pay the full amount you originally claimed, $800, in exchange for a complete release of all claims against the Brennan family and a public acknowledgement that the matter is settled forever." The offer was calculated to put Cartwright in an impossible position. If he accepted, he would receive far more than he was legally owed, but he would also lose face by backing down from his threatened seizure of the children. If he refused, he would appear to be rejecting a generous settlement in favor of pursuing what the crowd now understood to be an illegal and immoral course of action. Patrick Brennan stepped forward, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Mr. Yazzie, I can't accept such generosity. $800 is a fortune, more money than my family will see in a lifetime. How could we ever repay you?" Joseph turned to face the miner, his expression serious but kind. "Mr. Brennan, I'm not asking for repayment in money, but I would ask for something else, something that might be of value to both our families." "What?" Patrick asked, though his tone suggested he would agree to almost anything that kept his children safe. Joseph looked past Patrick to where Margaret stood with the 4 boys. His gaze lingered on Danny, the youngest, whose innocent face reminded him so painfully of his own lost son. "I would ask that you allow me to become part of your family," Joseph said quietly. "Not as a master or owner, but as an uncle, perhaps. Someone who could help teach your boys about the desert, about survival, about the old ways of reading the land and the sky. In return, I would help protect your family and ensure that no one ever again threatens to separate you." The request was so unexpected, so different from anything anyone had imagined, that for a moment the entire crowd fell silent. Margaret and Patrick exchanged a long look, communicating in the wordless way of couples who had shared years of hardship and joy. Finally, it was Thomas who spoke, his 16-year-old voice steady and mature. "Mr. Yazzie, you'd be willing to pay our debts and ask nothing in return except to be part of our family?" "Not nothing," Joseph corrected gently. "I would ask for the chance to teach you and your brothers skills that might keep you alive in this harsh country, and I would ask for the privilege of watching you grow into the men your parents are raising you to be." Margaret stepped forward, her intuitive understanding of human nature telling her that this strange Navajo man represented something rare and precious. Genuine goodness, motivated by his own pain, but directed toward healing rather than revenge. "Mr. Yazzie," she said quietly, "our family would be honored to have you as part of it. The boys could learn much from you and—" She paused, searching for words, "and perhaps you could find some peace with us." Joseph felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since losing Maria and little Wolf. The idea of having children to teach and protect again, of belonging to a family that wanted him rather than merely tolerating his presence, was almost overwhelming. Cartwright watched this exchange with growing fury, realizing that his carefully planned intimidation was collapsing into something that resembled a community celebration. The crowd was clearly on the side of the Brennan family and their unexpected protector, and even his own men seemed uncomfortable with the way events were unfolding. "This is absurd," Cartwright shouted. "I won't be dictated to by a mob and some Indian with delusions of grandeur. Brennan owes me money, and I'll collect it my way." He gestured sharply to his enforcers, who began to dismount despite the hostile crowd. But before they could take more than a few steps, Joseph moved with the fluid speed of a desert predator. In one smooth motion, he drew a long-bladed knife from his belt and stepped between Cartwright's men and the Brennan family. The blade caught the sunlight and seemed to glow with its own inner fire, and Joseph's stance made it clear that he was prepared to use it if necessary. "Gentlemen," Joseph said conversationally, though his eyes never left the enforcers' faces, "I believe we can resolve this matter without violence. But if you insist on pursuing your current course, you should know that I served as a scout for the army during the Apache campaigns. I learned many useful skills during that time." The crowd tensed, sensing that the confrontation was about to explode into violence. Sheriff Hawkins reached for his gun, but found his wrist caught in Dr. Morrison's surprisingly strong grip. "Sheriff," the doctor said quietly, "I'd be very careful about drawing weapons in this situation. There are a lot of witnesses here, and I suspect the territorial authorities would be very interested in a detailed report about today's events. It was Father Santos who provided the final resolution. The elderly priest stepped forward with his rosary still clutched in his hands, but his voice carried the moral authority of someone who had spent decades ministering to people in desperate situations. "Mr. Cartwright," Father Santos said in his heavily accented English, "you are a wealthy man with many resources. This family has nothing except each other. Surely your Christian conscience tells you that destroying them serves no purpose except cruelty." The priest's words, spoken with gentle sadness rather than anger, seemed to cut through the tension more effectively than any threat or argument. Even Cartwright's enforcers looked uncomfortable, and several members of the crowd nodded. Approvingly, Cartwright looked around at the sea of hostile faces and realized that he had lost not just this particular battle, but something much more important: the fear that had been his most valuable asset in controlling Copper Falls. If word spread that he could be successfully challenged, other families might find the courage to resist his predatory practices. But he was also a pragmatist who understood when retreat was the only viable option. $800 was indeed more than the Brennan family actually owed him, and accepting the payment would at least allow him to save some face while avoiding a confrontation that could escalate beyond his control. "Very well," Cartwright said stiffly, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I'll accept the Indians' payment as full settlement of all debts, but let me be clear. This doesn't change anything fundamental about how business is conducted in this territory." Joseph smiled, though there was no warmth in the expression. "Mr. Cartwright, I think you'll find that quite a lot has changed today, more than you might realize." As Joseph counted out the silver coins that would purchase the Brennan family's freedom, the crowd began to disperse with the satisfied air of people who had witnessed justice prevail over power. But the real story was just beginning, as a grieving Navajo warrior and an Irish mining family began the delicate process of building something unprecedented. A chosen family bound not by blood or tradition, but by mutual respect, shared values, and the determination to protect each other against whatever challenges the harsh frontier might bring. 3 weeks had passed since Joseph Yaz's dramatic intervention at the Brennan claim, and the uneasy peace that followed felt like the calm before a desert thunderstorm. The copper town of Copper Falls buzzed with rumors and speculation about the strange alliance between the Irish mining family and their Navajo protector, while darker currents of resentment and revenge swirled beneath the surface like underground streams seeking an outlet. Joseph had moved his few possessions into a small room he'd built onto the back of the Brennan cabin, paying for the materials and doing most of the construction work himself with help from Thomas and Michael. The addition was modest but well-crafted, reflecting Joseph's practical approach to life and his respect for the family's existing space. More importantly, it established his presence as permanent rather than temporary, sending a clear message. To anyone who might still harbor thoughts of threatening the Brennans, the integration hadn't been without its challenges. Danny had adapted most quickly to Joseph's presence, fascinated by the Navajo man's stories of desert survival and his seemingly magical ability to read weather patterns in cloud formations and wind directions. The 10-year-old followed Joseph around like a devoted puppy, absorbing lessons about tracking animals, finding water in seemingly barren landscapes, and understanding the subtle signs that warned of approaching danger. Sean, at 12, had been more skeptical initially, his protective instincts making him wary of any outsider who might threaten his family's stability. But Joseph's patient teaching and genuine respect for the boy's fierce loyalty had gradually won him over. Sean discovered that Joseph understood his anger about their family's treatment and channeled that emotion into useful skills rather than trying to suppress it. Michael, the artistic dreamer of the family, had found in Joseph an unexpected kindred spirit. The Navajo man understood beauty in ways that most frontier residents couldn't appreciate, seeing art in the patterns of erosion on canyon walls, poetry in the flight of hawks, and profound meaning in the interplay of light and shadow. Across the desert landscape, Joseph had begun teaching Michael to work with silver and turquoise, ancient Navajo crafts that provided a creative outlet for the boy's artistic temperament while also offering potential economic value. Thomas, as the eldest, had been the most reserved in his acceptance of Joseph's presence. At 16, he understood the complexities of their situation better than his younger brothers and worried about the long-term implications of their family's dependence on their protector's generosity. But Joseph's respectful approach to Patrick's authority and his obvious commitment to the family's welfare had gradually earned Thomas's trust and even admiration. The parents themselves had navigated the new arrangement with typical Irish pragmatism tempered by genuine gratitude. Patrick had initially struggled with accepting help from someone outside his immediate family, his pride chafing against the reality of their continued dependence on Joseph's resources. But as he watched his sons flourish under their new teacher's guidance, learning skills that could keep them alive in the harsh frontier environment, Patrick's reservations had given way to deep appreciation. Margaret had been perhaps the most perceptive about Joseph's emotional needs. She'd recognized the profound loneliness that drove his generosity and had quietly included him in the small domestic rituals that made a house feel like a home. Joseph found himself invited to help with cooking, asked for his opinion on household decisions, and included in the evening conversations that bound the family together after long days of work. But the peaceful integration of Joseph into the Brennan family had not gone unnoticed by those who preferred the old order of power and intimidation. Silas Cartwright had retreated after his public humiliation, but he hadn't forgotten or forgiven the challenge to his authority. Instead, he'd spent the weeks since the confrontation carefully planning a response that would restore his reputation for invincibility while eliminating the threat that Joseph Yazzie represented to his business model. Cartwright's opportunity came in the form of Marcus Webb, a territorial marshal who owed significant gambling debts to several of Cartwright's business associates. Webb was a hard man with a flexible relationship to justice, the kind of lawman who understood that badges could be tools for personal enrichment rather than public service. When Cartwright approached him with a proposition that would settle his debts while solving a mutual problem, Webb had been eager to cooperate. The plan was elegantly simple in its ruthlessness. Webb would arrive in Copper Falls with official territorial warrants for Joseph Yazzie's arrest on charges of inciting violence against legal debt collection, interfering with legitimate business operations, and threatening territorial officials in the performance of their duties. The charges were fabricated, but they would sound plausible to anyone who hadn't witnessed the actual confrontation, and Webb's credentials would make them difficult to challenge through normal legal channels. Once Joseph was in custody, Cartwright could move against the Brennan family with impunity. Without their protector's resources and intimidating presence, the family would be vulnerable to new debts, fresh accusations, and the kind of pressure that had originally threatened to tear them apart. This time, however, Cartwright intended to be more subtle in his approach, using legal mechanisms and financial manipulation rather than crude threats. The trap was sprung on a Tuesday morning when most of the town was going about its normal business. Marshal Webb rode into Copper Falls with 2 deputies and a set of official-looking documents that impressed the local sheriff and sent ripples of concern through the community. Word spread quickly that territorial law enforcement was looking For the Navajo man who'd caused such a stir 3 weeks earlier, Joseph was working with Thomas and Michael in the mine shaft when Margaret came running from the cabin, her face pale with fear and her voice breathless from the sprint down the rocky slope. "Joseph," she called into the dark opening, "you need to come up right now. There's a marshal in town asking questions about you, and people are saying he has warrants." The three males emerged from the mine, squinting in the bright sunlight, their faces and clothes covered with the fine dust that was an inevitable consequence of hard rock mining. Joseph listened quietly as Margaret explained what she'd heard from Wilhelm Hoffman, who'd sent his son running to warn them as soon as Webb had started making inquiries. "What kind of warrants?" Thomas asked, his young face tight with concern. "The boy wasn't sure," Margaret replied. "But Hoffman said the marshal was asking specifically about the confrontation with Cartwright, making it sound like you'd committed some kind of crime." Joseph felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. He'd expected retaliation from Cartwright, but he'd assumed it would come in the form of economic pressure or hired thugs, not legal manipulation. The use of territorial authority was both more sophisticated and more dangerous than anything he'd anticipated. "Where are Sean and Danny?" Joseph asked quietly. "At school," Margaret replied. "Should I go get them?" Joseph considered this carefully. If Webb intended to arrest him immediately, having all the boys present might create additional complications. But if this was part of a larger plan against the entire family, separating them could be even more dangerous. "No," he decided. "Let them finish the school day normally. We don't want to do anything that looks like we're running or hiding." Patrick had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Joseph, if there are territorial warrants involved, this could be serious. Maybe you should consider leaving until we can sort this out." Joseph shook his head firmly. "If I run now, Cartwright wins. Your family becomes vulnerable again, and nothing we've built together will survive. Besides," he added with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I'm curious to see exactly what crimes I'm supposed to have committed." An hour later, their curiosity was satisfied when Marshal Webb arrived at the Brennan claim, accompanied by Sheriff Hawkins and the 2 territorial deputies. Webb was a big man with the kind of soft belly that came from too much time in saloons and not enough time in the saddle, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. He carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone who'd learned that a badge could open many doors and close others. "Joseph Yazzie," Webb announced without preamble, "I have territorial warrants for your arrest on charges of interfering with legal business operations, threatening territorial officials, and inciting public violence. You need to come with me." Joseph stepped forward calmly, his hands visible and his posture non-threatening, despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "Marshal, may I see these warrants? I'd like to understand exactly what I'm being accused of." Webb's face flushed with annoyance. "You can read them in jail, Indian. Right now you're coming with me." "Actually," said a new voice from behind the deputies, "I think Mr. Yazzie has the right to examine any legal documents before he's taken into custody." Everyone turned to see Dr. Morrison climbing the path to the claim, his medical bag in one, hand and a thick book in the other. The doctor had obviously come prepared for a legal argument, and his presence immediately complicated Webb's simple arrest scenario. "Doctor," Webb said with forced politeness, "this is territorial business. I don't think medical expertise is required here." Dr. Morrison smiled pleasantly while opening his book to a marked page. "You're absolutely right, Marshal, but I do have some legal training from my university days, and I'm familiar with territorial statutes regarding arrest procedures. For instance, Section 247 of the Territorial Code clearly states that any person presented with arrest warrants has the right to examine those warrants and understand the specific charges before being taken into custody." Webb's flush deepened. "I don't have time for legal lectures from some frontier doctor." Of course not, Dr. Morrison agreed, but I suspect you do have time to follow proper legal procedures, especially when there are so many witnesses present. Indeed, word of the Marshal's arrival had spread through Copper Falls faster than gossip at a church social. Nearly 30 townspeople had made the trek up to the Brennan claim, drawn by curiosity and concern about the fate of the man who'd become something of a local hero for standing up to Cartwright's intimidation. Among the crowd was Wilhelm Hoffman, who stepped forward with his characteristic careful precision. Marshal Webb, as someone who keeps detailed records of local business transactions, I'd be very interested in seeing exactly what illegal activities Mr. Yazzie is supposed to have committed. To my knowledge, all of his actions have been perfectly legal. Webb found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The warrants he carried were legal in form, but questionable in substance, relying on creative interpretations of territorial statutes and testimony from witnesses who had obvious conflicts of interest. They were designed to facilitate a quick arrest and detention, not to withstand careful scrutiny from educated observers. "Fine," Webb said irritably, pulling the folded documents from his vest pocket. "But after you've had your look, he's coming with me." Dr. Morrison accepted the warrants and began reading them aloud for the benefit of the crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. As he read, murmurs of disbelief and anger began to ripple through the assembled townspeople. "The first charge," Dr. Morrison announced, "alleges that Mr. Yazzie interfered with legal debt collection by offering to pay the Brennan family's obligations. Apparently, paying someone else's debts is now considered criminal interference with business operations." The absurdity of this interpretation drew derisive laughter from several members of the crowd. Even some of the men who owed money to Cartwright began to look uncomfortable, realizing that such a broad interpretation of interference could be used against anyone who helped their neighbors in financial distress. "The second charge," Dr. Morrison continued, "claims that Mr. Yazzie threatened territorial officials by drawing a knife during the confrontation 3 weeks ago. However, I was present during that incident, and I observed Mr. Yazzie draw his knife only after Mr. Cartwright's armed men began dismounting with obvious hostile intent. Under territorial law, that would constitute lawful self-defense." Sheriff Hawkins shifted nervously, remembering his own role in the confrontation and wondering if his corruption might be exposed by a more detailed investigation. "The third charge alleges that Mr. Yazzie incited public violence by encouraging the crowd to resist lawful authority. Again, I was present during the entire incident, and I heard no such encouragement. Mr. Yazzie consistently attempted to resolve the situation peacefully through legal payment of the disputed debt." Dr. Morrison folded the warrants and handed them back to Webb with the satisfied expression of a man who just performed a successful surgery. "Marshal, these charges appear to be based on misrepresentations of the actual events. I suspect that any competent attorney could have them dismissed within a matter of hours." Webb's face had turned an alarming shade of red during this recitation, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Perhaps we should discuss this situation from a different perspective." Father Santos had arrived while Dr. Morrison was reading the warrants, and his presence added yet another layer of moral authority to the proceedings. The elderly priest moved slowly through the crowd, his lined face grave with concern. "Marshal Webb," Father Santos said quietly, "I've been ministering to this community for many years, and I've seen how families are destroyed when the law serves only the powerful. Mr. Yazzie prevented a great injustice 3 weeks ago. Arresting him now would compound that injustice. Father," Webb said through gritted teeth, "I respect your position, but I have my orders." "Orders from whom?" Dr. Morrison asked pointedly. "These warrants were issued by Territorial Judge Harrison. who coincidentally owes substantial gambling debts to several of Mr. Cartwright's business associates. That raises interesting questions about judicial independence. The crowd's murmurs were growing louder and more hostile. Webb realized that his simple arrest was turning into a public trial of Cartwright's entire system of control, and the verdict was clearly going against his employer. It was Thomas Brennan who provided the next surprise. The 16-year-old stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd been forced to mature beyond his years, carrying a rolled paper that he handed to Dr. Morrison. "Doctor," Thomas said clearly, "I think you should see this. It's a letter that arrived yesterday from the territorial capital." Dr. Morrison unrolled the paper and began reading, his eyebrows rising with each sentence. When he finished, he looked up at Marshal Webb with an expression of grim satisfaction. "How interesting," Dr. Morrison said. "This letter is from the Territorial Attorney General's office, informing the local sheriff that they're investigating complaints about fraudulent debt collection practices in the Copper Falls district. Apparently, several families have written to the capital describing systematic abuse by local business interests." Webb felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. If the territorial government was already investigating Cartwright's operations, arresting Joseph Yazzie could bring unwanted attention to the entire network of corruption that had made their scheme possible. Furthermore, Dr. Morrison continued, the letter specifically mentions that any legal actions taken against individuals who've assisted families in debt distress should be carefully reviewed for potential abuse of process. The crowd's mood was now openly hostile to Webb and his deputies. These were hard-working people who'd seen too many neighbors victimized by Cartwright's predatory practices, and they were in no mood to watch their newly discovered champion arrested. On obviously fabricated charges, Wilhelm Hoffman stepped forward again, this time carrying his ledger book and wearing the expression of a man who decided to risk everything on a single throw of the dice. "Marshal Webb," Hoffman said formally, "as a witness to the events in question and as someone who maintains detailed records of local business transactions, I'm prepared to swear out a complaint against Silas Cartwright for fraud, usury, and attempted human trafficking. I have documentation supporting all of these charges." The statement hit the crowd like lightning striking dry timber. Everyone knew that Hoffman was an honest man whose records were meticulous and accurate. If he was willing to make such serious accusations in public with a territorial marshal as witness, it meant the carefully maintained silence around Cartwright's operations was finally breaking down. Webb looked around at the sea of hostile faces and realized that he'd walked into a trap of his own making. Instead of a simple arrest that would restore Cartwright's authority, he'd provoked a public uprising that threatened to expose the entire network of corruption that had made his own prosperity possible. "I think," Webb said carefully, "that there may have been some misunderstanding about the facts surrounding these charges. Perhaps it would be appropriate to conduct a more thorough investigation before proceeding with any arrests." Dr. Morrison smiled coldly. "An excellent suggestion, Marshal. I'm sure the Territorial Attorney General's office would be very interested in a complete and thorough investigation of all the facts." Joseph had remained silent throughout this exchange, watching with fascination as the community rallied to his defense. He'd expected to face this challenge alone, relying on his own resources and skills to survive whatever Cartwright could devise. Instead, he'd discovered that his intervention on behalf of the Brennan family had inspired others to find their own courage and speak their own truth. But Joseph also understood that this victory was only temporary. Cartwright was too powerful and too ruthless to be defeated by a single public confrontation, no matter how decisive it might appear. The real test would come later, when the crowd had dispersed, and the community's attention had moved on to other concerns. As Webb and his Deputies prepared to leave with their mission unfulfilled. Joseph stepped forward to address the marshal directly. "Marshal Webb," Joseph said quietly, "I want you to understand something clearly. I'm not running, I'm not hiding, and I'm not afraid of Silas Cartwright or anyone who works for him. If you want to arrest me, you'd better have real evidence of real crimes, not fabricated charges designed to silence someone who threatens corrupt business practices." Webb met Joseph's steady gaze and saw something there that made him look away first. This wasn't just a man defending his own interests. This was a warrior who'd found a cause worth fighting for, and such men were dangerous in ways that went far beyond physical violence. "We'll be in touch," Webb muttered, mounting his horse. With as much dignity as he could manage, as the marshal and his men rode away, the crowd began to disperse with the satisfied air of people who'd witnessed justice prevail over corruption. But Joseph knew the real battle was just beginning, and the next attack would come from a direction none of them could anticipate. The test of fire had revealed the strength of the community's support for the Brennan family and their protector, but it had also exposed the depths of Cartwright's determination to destroy anyone who challenged his authority. The desert wind carried the scent of distant storms, and Joseph Yazzie prepared himself for whatever thunder and lightning might follow. The attack came at dawn on a Saturday morning, when the desert still held the cool breath of night, and most of Copper Falls slept peacefully in their beds. Joseph's eyes snapped open at the first sound of hoofbeats on the rocky trail leading to the Brennan claim. His warrior instincts honed by years of survival in hostile territory, recognizing the particular rhythm of riders approaching with violent intent. He rolled silently from his bedroll and moved to the small window he'd cut into the wall of his addition to the cabin. What he saw in the gray pre-dawn light made his blood run cold. 15 mounted men were surrounding their property with the methodical precision of a military operation, their faces masked by bandanas and their weapons clearly visible in the pale starlight. But these weren't Cartwright's usual enforcers or hired thugs from the local saloons. Joseph's experienced eye recognized the disciplined movement and tactical positioning of men with military training, professional gunfighters, and mercenaries who commanded high prices for their deadly skills. Cartwright had clearly decided that subtle legal maneuvering wasn't sufficient to eliminate the threat Joseph represented, and had escalated to direct violence with enough firepower to overwhelm any resistance. Joseph moved swiftly but silently through the cabin, gently shaking each family member awake while pressing a finger to his lips to ensure they remained quiet. Patrick's eyes widened with alarm as he saw the knife in Joseph's hand and understood immediately that mortal danger had found them in the safety of their own home. "How many?" Patrick whispered, reaching for the old military rifle he kept hidden beneath his bed. 15. "Maybe more," Joseph replied quietly. "Professional killers, not local men. They mean to finish this permanently." Margaret gathered Danny close to her, while Thomas, Michael and Sean clustered around their father, their young faces pale but determined in the dim light filtering through the cabin's single window. The family had discussed this possibility during the weeks since Marshal Webb's failed arrest attempt, and everyone knew their survival would depend on following Joseph's lead without question or hesitation. "The mine shaft," Joseph said simply. "It's the only defensible position we have." The abandoned mine shaft behind their cabin descended 40 feet into solid rock, with only one entrance that could be easily defended by a single man with adequate ammunition. More importantly, Joseph had spent the previous weeks preparing it as an emergency refuge, stocking it with water, dried food, and additional weapons in case Cartwright's retaliation took exactly this form. The family moved like shadows through their own home, gathering only essential supplies and weapons while Joseph kept watch through the window. The attackers had completed their encirclement, but hadn't yet moved to close the trap, apparently waiting for full daylight to begin their assault. Their discipline and patience confirmed Joseph's assessment that these were professionals who understood the value of careful preparation over reckless aggression. As the Brennans prepared to leave their cabin, possibly forever, Margaret made a decision that revealed the depth of her character. She moved quickly to the small wooden box where she kept her most precious possessions, a few photographs, her wedding ring that Patrick had redeemed from the pawnshop with Joseph's money, and a letter from her sister in Boston. But instead of taking these irreplaceable mementos, she removed a folded piece of paper and pressed it into Joseph's hand. "What is this?" Joseph whispered. "Legal adoption papers," Margaret replied quietly. "I had Wilhelm Hoffman help me prepare them. If we don't survive this, I want it official that you're Danny's guardian. He'll need someone who understands what it means to lose family." Joseph felt his throat tighten with emotion. He couldn't afford to indulge in their current circumstances. The gesture represented a level of trust and acceptance that went far beyond simple gratitude for his protection. Margaret was offering him something he'd thought lost forever: the legal and moral responsibility of fatherhood, the chance to guide a child's growth and ensure his safety, even in the face of overwhelming danger. "Margaret," Joseph whispered, "we're all going to survive this. I give you my word." But even as he spoke the promise, Joseph understood the mathematical reality of their situation. 15 professional gunfighters against one aging Navajo warrior, an Irish miner with limited combat experience, and a 16-year-old boy who'd never fired a shot in anger. The odds were so overwhelming that survival would require not just courage and skill, but the kind of desperate improvisation that turned hopeless battles into legendary stories. The family moved in single file through the pre-dawn darkness, Joseph leading and Patrick bringing up the rear with his rifle ready. They'd covered perhaps half the distance to the mine shaft when a voice called out from the darkness with the casual confidence of a predator who knows his prey has nowhere to run. "Joseph Yazzie, we know you're out there. Mr. Cartwright has a message for you." Joseph gestured for the family to drop to the ground behind a cluster of boulders while he studied the terrain ahead. The voice had come from their left, near the cabin, which meant the speaker was trying to draw them into a conversation that would reveal their position to the other attackers. "Yazzie," the voice called again, "no need for your new family to die for your pride. Come out peaceful-like, and we'll make this quick for everyone." The casual mention of making death quick for the entire family confirmed what Joseph had already suspected. This wasn't an arrest or intimidation, but an execution designed to eliminate witnesses and send a message to anyone else who might consider challenging Cartwright's authority. Joseph's mind raced through tactical options as he studied the landscape between their position and the relative safety of the mine shaft. The distance was perhaps 100 yards across open ground, with only scattered rocks and desert brush for cover. Moving the entire family across that killing field without being spotted would be virtually impossible, but sending them alone while he created a distraction would be tantamount to suicide. It was Thomas who provided the unexpected solution, his 16-year-old mind working with the desperate creativity of youth facing mortal danger. "Uncle Joseph," he whispered, using the title that had become natural over the past weeks, "what if we don't try to hide? What if we make them think we're doing something else entirely?" Joseph looked at the boy with new respect. "What do you mean?" "The mine shaft connects to the old Martinez claim through an underground passage. I've been exploring it with Michael. If we can get into our mine, we can travel underground for almost a quarter-mile and come up behind them." Joseph felt a surge of hope, mixed with admiration for Thomas's quick thinking. The boy was proposing a flanking maneuver that would turn their desperate retreat into a tactical advantage, using knowledge of the local terrain that the attackers couldn't possibly possess. "How long would it take?" Joseph asked. "Maybe 20 minutes through the passage. It's narrow and partly flooded, but we can make it." Joseph looked at the rest of the family, seeing determination mixed with fear in their faces. Margaret nodded, slightly understanding that this represented their best chance for survival. Even Danny seemed to grasp the gravity of their situation, his young face serious but trusting. "Then we go," Joseph decided. "But once we're underground, everyone does exactly what I say without question. Our lives depend on perfect coordination." What followed was the most harrowing 25 minutes in the Brennan family's collective memory. The journey through the mine shaft and connecting passage was a nightmare of crawling through spaces barely wide enough for adult shoulders, wading through ice-cold underground streams, and navigating by touch through absolute darkness while trying to remain completely silent. Joseph led the way with the confident efficiency of someone who'd learned underground movement during his scouting days with the army. Behind him, the family moved with the desperate determination of people who understood that failure meant death not just for themselves, but for everyone they loved. When they finally emerged from the Martinez Claims entrance, the sun had fully risen, and the sound of gunfire was echoing across the desert. The attackers had apparently grown impatient and begun their assault on the empty Brennan cabin, not realizing their targets had vanished into the earth like desert spirits. Joseph positioned the family in cover behind the ruins of the Martinez mine's equipment shed and studied the tactical situation with the cold calculation of a professional warrior. The attackers had indeed split their force, with most of their men focused on the cabin while only 3 or 4 maintained perimeter security. More importantly, their attention was completely focused on the structures they were attacking, leaving their rear approach virtually undefended. What happened next became the stuff of legend in Copper Falls, though the survivors would argue for years about the exact details. Joseph Yazzie seemed to transform from a middle-aged Navajo trader into something from the old stories. A desert ghost who struck without warning and disappeared like smoke on the wind. Moving with silence that seemed supernatural, Joseph worked his way through the attackers' rear positions, eliminating sentries with techniques learned during the Apache campaigns. But instead of killing, he used pressure points and strategic blows that rendered his targets unconscious without permanent harm. A mercy they certainly didn't deserve, but which reflected Joseph's fundamental respect for human life. The real genius of his strategy became apparent when the remaining attackers realized they were being hunted by an invisible enemy. Professional killers who'd faced cavalry charges and outlaw gangs found themselves terrorized by an opponent they couldn't predict and couldn't understand. The disciplined military formation dissolved into confusion and panic as men who made their living through violence discovered what it felt like to be the prey rather than the predators. The final confrontation came when the leader of the mercenaries, a scarred veteran named Clay Morrison, found himself facing Joseph in single combat while his remaining men fled into the desert. Morrison was skilled, experienced, and utterly ruthless, but he was fighting a man who had something worth dying for. And that made all the difference. When the dust settled and the desert wind carried away the gun smoke, Joseph Yazzie stood alone, among the scattered weapons and abandoned horses of men who'd learned too late that some fights weren't worth winning. The Brennan family emerged from their hiding place to find their protector wounded but victorious, and their home still standing despite the bullet holes that would forever remind them of how close they'd come to losing everything. As Joseph collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion, the last thing he saw was Danny's small face looking down at him with the absolute trust that only children could maintain in the face of incomprehensible adult violence. In that moment, Joseph understood that he'd found something he'd thought lost forever, Not just a family to protect, but a reason to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. 5 years had passed since the dawn battle that shattered Cartwright's reign of terror, and the copper mining town of Copper Falls had transformed into something unrecognizable from its violent beginnings. The changes started small: a new territorial judge who couldn't be bought, a sheriff elected by honest votes rather than corrupt influence, businesses that treated workers as human beings rather than expendable resources. But the real transformation was deeper, rooted in the example of courage that an unlikely alliance between an Irish family and a Navajo warrior had demonstrated on that desperate morning. Dr. Morrison, now serving as the town's unofficial historian, often remarked that civilizations weren't built by laws and governments, but by individuals who chose to stand against injustice even when the odds seemed impossible. The Brennan-Yazzie family had become living proof of that principle, their story spreading throughout the Arizona territory and inspiring other communities to resist the predatory practices that had once seemed as inevitable as desert storms. The most visible change was the house itself. What had begun as a simple one-room cabin had grown into a sprawling adobe compound that reflected both Irish practicality and Navajo aesthetics. Thomas, now 21, had proven remarkably gifted at construction and design, creating spaces that honored both cultures while serving the practical needs of a large, complex family. The original cabin remained at the center, preserved as a reminder of where their journey had begun, but surrounding it were workshops, storage buildings, and living quarters that accommodated not just the immediate family, but the steady stream of visitors who came seeking Joseph's wisdom or the family's hospitality. The mine had indeed proven profitable, but not in the way Patrick had originally imagined. Instead of copper, Thomas and Michael had discovered a rich vein of silver that provided the family with more than enough income to live comfortably without the crushing labor that had nearly destroyed them. More importantly, Joseph's business, connections throughout the Southwest, had opened markets for their ore that paid fair prices without the exploitation that characterized most territorial mining operations. Michael, now 19, had become one of the most sought-after silversmiths in the territory, his work combining traditional Navajo techniques with Irish decorative motifs to create pieces that were both beautiful and meaningful. His artistic vision had matured under Joseph's patient teaching, but his subjects increasingly reflected the multicultural world he inhabited. Desert landscapes populated by both Celtic symbols and Navajo spirits. Jewelry that told stories of two peoples learning to become one family. Sean, at 17, had discovered an unexpected talent for diplomacy and communication. He'd become Joseph's primary assistant in the trading business, his quick wit and natural charm making him popular with customers from every background and culture. But more importantly, Sean had inherited his mentor's gift for reading people's true intentions, a skill that made him invaluable in negotiations and conflict resolution. Danny, now 15 and nearly as tall as his older brothers, had grown into a young man who embodied the best qualities of both his heritage and his chosen family. He spoke fluent Navajo and Spanish in addition to English, could read weather patterns like an ancient text, and possessed an intuitive understanding of desert survival that impressed even experienced guides. But perhaps most remarkably, he'd retained the infectious joy and optimism that had made him special as a child, qualities that seemed to brighten every room he entered. Joseph himself had aged gracefully, his silver-streaked hair and lined face giving him the appearance of a patriarch who'd earned his wisdom through experience rather than inheritance. The wounds from the final battle had healed cleanly, leaving only faint scars that served as reminders of how close they'd all come to losing everything. But the deeper wounds, the grief and loneliness that had driven him to intervene in the Brennan family's crisis, had healed as well, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging that filled the emptiness in his heart. Patrick and Margaret had thrived in ways that would have seemed impossible during their darkest days. Patrick had discovered that success in mining required patience and observation rather than desperate digging, qualities that Joseph's teachings had helped him develop. Margaret had become the unofficial mother to half the children in Copper Falls, her combination of Irish warmth and practical wisdom, making her the person families turned to when they needed guidance or support. The formal adoption papers that Margaret had pressed into Joseph's hand during the Dawn attack had been filed and approved, making Danny legally Joseph's son while maintaining his emotional connections to the rest of the family. It was a unique arrangement that reflected the unique circumstances of their relationship, but it had proven remarkably stable and nurturing for everyone involved. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, the extended family gathered for their weekly dinner on the wide veranda that overlooked the valley. The meal was a blend of Irish stew and Navajo fry bread, accompanied by stories and laughter that carried across the desert like music. Joseph watched his sons, for that's how he'd come to think of all 4 boys, discussing their plans for expanding the trading business into new territories, and felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond simple paternal pride. These young men had grown into exactly the kind of people the world needed, strong enough to protect what mattered, wise enough to build rather than destroy, and compassionate enough to help others find their own paths to dignity and prosperity. "Uncle Joseph," Danny said, using the title that had evolved into something more formal than mere family relationship. "Tell us again about the morning you decided to help us." Joseph smiled, understanding that this wasn't really about hearing a familiar story, but about reinforcing the bonds that held their unusual family together. "I was watching from the ridge," he began, "and I saw a family that refused to surrender their dignity even when powerful men tried to take everything they had. I realized that sometimes the most important thing we can do is choose to stand with people who are fighting for something worthwhile. And you chose us," Thomas said quietly. "No," Joseph corrected gently, "you chose me. You opened your family to a stranger who had nothing to offer except his willingness to fight alongside you. That's what real strength looks like, not the power to dominate others, but the courage to trust and include them." As the stars emerged in the clear desert sky and the family prepared for another peaceful night in their secure home, Joseph reflected on the strange mathematics of loss and redemption. He'd lost a wife and son to violence and circumstance beyond his control, but he'd gained 4 sons and a daughter through choices that honored the memory of what he'd lost, while building something new and precious. The desert wind carried the sound of laughter and quiet conversation as the Brennan-Yazzie family settled into another evening of the life they'd built together. A life that proved families could be formed by choice as well as blood, and that love was indeed stronger than fear when people found the courage to act on their deepest convictions. The story that began with children being sold like cattle had become a testament to the power of unexpected alliances and the enduring strength of families that chose to include rather than exclude, to build rather than destroy, to stand together against whatever challenges the frontier might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.